Of course, something else is happening today, and that is leaders around the world are scurrying off to Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt for COP27, the latest climate gabfest. The attendance list includes US President Joe Biden. He'll be looking a bit the worse for wear, I imagine. British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, who has done a Morrison-style U-turn and is now going to COP27. Seems these prime ministers are easily bullied. I wonder who's pulling the strings. And French President Emmanuel Macron, who isn't going. Yes, Mr Albanese. And as you heard, he has a very busy schedule. Let's have a listen.
Well, the Prime Minister won't be attending the COP27 climate summit to be held in Egypt from Sunday.
I can't be in all places at once, and I'm sure that if I was going, people would say, why aren't I attending Parliament? I have a very busy schedule of Parliament, then the international conferences, then back to Parliament.
Oh, too busy to save the planet. Oh, Albo. Now, cast your mind back just over a year ago when the Scottish city of Glasgow was hosting COP26. They've chosen an Egyptian, they've got as close to the equator as they possibly can, by the way, because all these northern winter ones are always freezing as they were talking about global warming. Anyway, so they've gone as close to the equator. Egypt, surely that's hot, they've gone. Anyway, Prime Minister Scott Morrison had initially not committed to going, you'll remember. The correct decision, by the way, which we certainly advised him on this show, don't go to Glasgow, you'll regret it, Scomo, but Scomo did. And the Labor shadow cabinet was going hell for leather at Scomo about not going to Glasgow. Penny Wong tweeted, Australia has a seat at the table, but Mr Morrison is thinking about not turning up to the G20 and the Glasgow summit, COP26. This is where our future will be decided, affecting everything from climate to jobs. Why is Mr Morrison never where Australia needs him to be? Asked Penny. And then the protest got only louder.
Bill, do you reckon Scott Morrison's going to go to this climate summit in Glasgow at the end of the month? And should he?
Oh, I think he should. I mean, when there's a meeting of world leaders, I want Australia's leader to be there. I think that Mr Morrison dodging the Glasgow climate conference when it's one of the big issues the world's going to work on, I think that is like a kid not bringing his homework or turning up to school that day. He just wants an excuse note from his parents.
Should the PM go to Glasgow?
Oh, look, it's pretty extraordinary not to take the opportunity to be at the table when these huge decisions are being made. They have a huge effect on Australia and our future, and it makes sense to me that Australia would be represented at the highest level at something like this.
Of course, none of that applies to Albo. No. Ooh, heaven forbid. In the end, as we know, Scott Morrison foolishly listened to the likes of Dave Sharma and Simon Birmingham, and he folded and Scomo folded like a cheap deck chair in a southerly buster on Manly Beach and scurried off to Glasgow, where he completely betrayed the commitment he had made at the 2019 election to not sign Australia up to net zero. In doing so, Scomo managed to not only make a fool of himself and Australia on the international stage, as I predicted, they were always going to be unimpressed by anything Australia says or does, but Scomo also guaranteed that the Liberals would lose the following election, the 2022 one, which they did, because they had abandoned their core principles and had no arguments with which to attack Labor, the Greens or the Teals on their insane climate agenda. And they still don't. Peter Dutton is still struggling to escape from Morrison's disastrous betrayal and entirely predictable blunder. But I digress. There was one other individual who also joined in that pile-on demanding Scott Morrison betray his own election commitments and go to Glasgow to sign us up to net zero. Oh yes, of course, here he is, Albo.
The Prime Minister should attend the Glasgow conference and he should represent Australia. If he doesn't, it's because he's embarrassed about Australia's position. It would be absurd if he was absent from presence at Glasgow.
Can you bear the hypocrisy oozing out of every pore of that man? Yes, Anthony Albanese, the same man who's telling us now he's too busy to attend a climate conference because he's got so much on his plate. Every other leader is attending. But when Scomo did it, oh, dreadful, terrible, terrible thing. You know, after all, Albo has more important considerations, particularly the need to stop opposition leader Peter Dutton from breathing down his neck. It is called hypocrisy. We get used to it, we take it for granted, do we, amongst our leaders, but it is sickening. And it's not just Labor that's guilty of it. Yes, it's the usual protection racket. Watch this mob.
Young Australian climate campaigners are demanding Scott Morrison attend the UN climate change conference in Glasgow next month.
Controversially, the PM has already flagged that he may not even go to Glasgow, citing the pressures of COVID. It would be a huge signal to the world if he did not, and a huge signal to voters at the looming federal election.
How conspicuous would it be for Australia's Prime Minister to not attend?
That would send a really, really bad message to the rest of the world.
OK, so that's the ABC. You know, setting it all up. That was David Lipson. Now have a listen. So they attacked Scomo relentlessly. Now contrast that with how the same journalist deals with Albo not going to COP27.
The United Nations annual climate change summit is about to kick off in Egypt as world leaders prepare to descend on the city of Sharm el-Sheikh. Those from wealthy nations are being called on to do more to fight global warming.
While US President Joe Biden and UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak have both committed to attending the UN summit, Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese is sending Climate Change and Energy Minister Chris Bowen instead. Director of Melbourne Climate Futures, Professor Jacqueline Peel, says climate finance will be top of the agenda for all world leaders.
See, just segued beautifully. No mention, no criticism of Albo. No, that's all fine. The ABC is nothing but the Labor Party and the Greens Party mouthpiece, and we pay for it. It's a disgrace. Mind you, that's not what they were saying when they were reporting the big issues in climate change this week. Have a listen to the ABC's Sarah Ferguson.
You clearly think that the phrase climate change isn't enough now to describe the situation that we're in, that the climate is breaking down and destabilising. Do you think that that process is irreversible?
I mean...
How dare you, ABC?